Welcome to RaWMachines, a journey into some of the world's most remarkable production processes. In the previous episode, we followed the first half of the traditional hand linen weaving journey, where human skill and physical labor gave form and structure to the cloth. In this chapter, the story moves outdoors, entering a slower phase in which nature and time complete the remaining work, preparing the linen for everyday use. Let's begin. At the farmstead at 27 Kirchbergstrasse, the traditional craft of hand-woven linen is still preserved. Wilhelm Mosel and Albert Gebert, who once wove flax cloth in their own homes, are reviving this nearly vanished labor skill on an old hand loom.
So, der Strick hängt da an. Guck mal, ob die Drähte richtig hängen unten.
Ja.
After Wilhelm Mosel, assisted by Otto Klus, completed warping the beam and sizing the warp threads, the loom was inspected to ensure stable operation. The reed width and the steel heddle frames were then installed in their final working positions on the loom.
So, da gucken wir unten nach der Fußtritte.
The reed had to move smoothly and evenly through the warp. As the heddle frames were raised and lowered, the warp separated into two distinct layers, one lifted, the other lowered, ensuring that no thread snagged or shifted out of alignment. The sheds formed in this process needed to be clear and stable, allowing the shuttle carrying the weft yarn to pass back and forth without obstruction.
So, wo ist jetzt die Mitte?
At the upper section of the loom, on the lease rods positioned within the warp, Otto Klus suspended an octagonal wooden weight, weighted with horseshoes. Its function was to keep the lease rods continuously drawn back toward the warp beam throughout the weaving process.
Ist gut. Stramm genug. Spielchen und das Schiffchen bringst du mal.
Before beginning a test weave, Otto Klus turned the cloth beam to apply the necessary tension to the warp. To commence weaving, a bobbin wound with weft yarn was placed into the shuttle, ready for insertion through the shed. Once the loom had been fully adjusted and the warp brought to the required tension, a test weave was carried out to check its operation. Wilhelm Mosel placed an elderwood bobbin into the shuttle and began weaving. As the heddle frames opened the shed, the shuttle was thrown through the warp to carry the weft to the opposite side. The reed was then driven forward to beat in the yarn and form the cloth. Through these actions, the performance of the entire loom was tested and fine-tuned. During weaving, the breakage of even a single warp thread could interrupt the entire operation. In Dickensheed, to stabilize the cloth edges, the weaver used a flat-grooved wooden piece set along the selvage, keeping the edge threads correctly aligned. After several test passes, the fabric structure revealed that the preparatory stages, from hackling to winding, had been executed with proper technique. The surface of the cloth gradually began to display the defining characteristics of traditional linen weave. As the loom entered a phase of steady weaving, Otto Kloos replaced the small reed used for testing with a larger, heavier reed. This reed was designed to withstand stronger beating and the higher warp tension required for continuous production. During weaving, the weaver regulated the warp beam using a rope and locking peg, releasing the warp in small increments to maintain consistent tension. A geared mechanism allowed the warp threads to be let off evenly in step with the progress of the cloth. Once the fabric reached a length of about 10 centimeters, Wilhelm Mosel installed the cloth stretcher. This device consisted of two slightly curved flat boards set opposite each other, with small metal teeth at each end, fixed into the selve edges. The cloth stretcher kept the fabric taut and stable within the working area. As a result, the beating action of the reed and the movement of the shuttle proceeded evenly, ensuring smooth operation of the loom. A skilled linen weaver could produce around 10 ells, nearly 5 meters of cloth, in a single day. The shed formed by the heddle frames opened and closed in a steady rhythm, allowing the shuttle carrying the weft to pass through. With the simple weave used here, each depression of a treadle lifted half of the warp threads. After the shuttle passed and the reed beat in the weft, the opposite treadle was engaged, reversing the position of the warp threads. This alternation created both the fabric structure and the characteristic working rhythm of hand linen weaving. After Wilhelm Mosel had woven the required length of cloth, the leading end of the fabric was secured in preparation for winding it onto the cloth beam. This step, known as underlaying the cloth, served to attach the woven fabric to the take-up beam and to maintain even tension during the subsequent stages of work. First, the rope was released from the breast beam to free the winding mechanism. Working together, the two men wound the leading edge of the cloth. Otto Kloos placed the lease rod carrying the warp ends into the groove of the cloth beam. The fabric was then wound evenly onto the beam by means of the gear mechanism, ensuring straight take-up without skewing. Finally, the cloth beam was turned to retention the warp. This tension was secured with a locking peg, fixing the fabric firmly in place and preparing the loom for the next phase of weaving.
Ja. Zo, kom maar raus, Otto. Maar versuchen, ob die richtig springen tut. Jawohl.
Geht.
Ja.
Geht gut. Ja, so machen wir.
Once the underlaying process was complete, the loom was ready for continuous weaving. At this stage, Albert Gebert replaced Wilhelm Mosel at the loom. This change was intended to ensure uniformity in the cloth. Because the force of the reeds beating and the rhythm of operation vary from one weaver to another, changing operators can introduce differences in thread density, visible as sections of fabric that are unevenly tight or loose. When the weft bobbin was exhausted, Albert Gebert replaced it with a new one and set it into the shuttle. The end of the spent yarn was joined to the new thread with a weaver's knot, small and secure enough to pass through the shed without obstruction. To ensure a constant supply of weft, flax yarn was continuously wound onto small elderwood bobbins. This task was carried out by Otto Kloos in parallel with the weaving. He used a bobbin winder. The empty bobbin was mounted on the rotating spindle, and flax yarn, drawn from a larger spool remaining from the warp preparation, was wound evenly onto the small bobbin, ready for use. During weaving, Albert Geberts adjusted the cloth stretcher to keep the fabric under steady tension in the working area. At the same time, he used a salvant tool to smooth the selve edges, preventing yarn fraying and uneven edges. Compared with processes such as warp preparation or yarn winding, plain linen weaving does not demand complex technique. Patterned weaves and more elaborate fabric structures, however, can only be produced on specialized looms. Such looms may be equipped with multiple heddle frames and treadles, requiring highly skilled weavers and long periods of training. By contrast, in household linen weaving, looms typically carried only 2 to 4 heddle frames, well suited to producing plain linen for everyday use. During weaving, the weaver periodically released the locking pegs of both the warp beam and the cloth beam, allowing the warp to be let off evenly, while the woven fabric was taken up onto the cloth beam. When a warp thread broke, weaving had to be stopped immediately. The broken thread was rejoined, drawn back through the reed, and secured to the cloth stretcher. Any excess thread ends were dealt with later by sewing them into the finished cloth and trimming them off. In parallel with repairing breaks, newly released warp threads had to be resized. The weaver applied sizing to the threads to increase smoothness and strength, enabling them to withstand friction during weaving. For this operation, the lease rods were spread apart and the warp was drawn taut before the sizing was applied. During weaving, Albert Gebert used 2 brushes to apply a thin layer of sizing to both sides of the warp, increasing its strength and reducing friction as the threads continued to be let off. After about 3 days of work, the warp on the warp beam was nearly exhausted. To complete the remaining length of cloth, the warp had to be extended. Wilhelm Mosel removed from the warp beam the lease rod carrying the final ends of the warp, known as the trum.
So, jetzt können wir durchstricken.
The 2 men then suspended from this rod a wooden bar fitted with iron hooks to provide additional pulling weight. In local usage at Dickenscheid, this extension device was also referred to as the donkey. Finally, the cord of this assembly was secured back onto the warp beam, allowing the necessary tension to be maintained as weaving continued. Once the warp had been extended and the loom brought back into operation, weaving entered a phase of prolonged, continuous work. It was this form of labor, repetitive and sustained over long periods, that left clear and lasting effects on the health of the weaver. As weaving on the loom approached the end of a run, the lease rods in the warp gradually slid toward the heddle frames and came to rest against them. This reduced the freedom of movement of the heddles and made the formation of a clean shed increasingly difficult. To prevent this, the first lease rods were removed from the warp. At the very end of the run, the weaver inserted an additional lease rod into the cloth to fix the position of the warp threads. This rod was then cut free together with the surplus cloth and the warp ends. Its purpose was to prevent the warp within the heddle frames from slipping out. When a new run was begun, the rod was reinserted into the groove of the breast beam to stabilize the warp once again. After completing the weaving run, Wilhelm Mosel cut the cloth at the front of the lease rod that had been woven in. To prevent the cut edge from fraying, the edge was sewn over with linen thread.
sawdust. Goed, als je komst, hang met de ezel op.
To remove the heddle assembly from the loom, Otto Kloos first detached the tension weight. Wilhelm Mosel then withdrew the remaining lease rods from the end of the warp. The two men loosened the rope of the donkey from the warp beam and separated this device from the lease rod carrying the warp ends. Within the heddle frames, there remained a length of surplus cloth, the woven-in lease rod, and the final ends of the warp. These components were left intact, so they could be connected to a new warp for the next weaving run, thereby avoiding the need to rethread each thread through the heddle eyes and the reed. To remove the heddle assembly, Wilhelm Mosel inserted two lease rods into the breast beam, pulled the entire heddle set slightly forward, and secured it in that position. This allowed the lease rods to be withdrawn from the loops formed by the final warp threads. The warp loops now hung in front of the heddle frames. They were carefully stacked and bundled to prevent damage during transport or storage of the heddle assembly.
Etwas in die Hand.
Next, the heddle frames were detached from the treadles and the suspension system. The reed, together with the remaining warp, was also removed from the beater. To clear space around the loom and allow the cloth to be taken off, the beater was swung aside, while the treadle pins were removed and set aside.
Etwas in die Hand.
Before removing the cloth from the beam, Otto Kloos brushed away the lint and fiber dust that had accumulated during weaving to prevent soiling the fabric as it was unwound. He then disengaged the gear of the cloth beam to release the take-up mechanism. This allowed the cloth to be fully let off the beam. Once removed, the fabric, now more than 10 meters long, was folded out on the floor for inspection of its appearance and uniformity.
Legt werden.
So meine ich.
Before the cloth could be used or exchanged, weaving faults were corrected and loose threads were sewn into the selvages. The fabric was then washed and grass bleached, a traditional method that brightened the color and stabilized the quality of the linen fibers. Only after these steps was the cloth ready for further treatment, such as dyeing by the blueprinting technique. Until the bleaching stage, typically carried out in summer or early autumn after the harvest, the fabric was rolled up and stored in chests or cupboards, awaiting use. After weaving was completed during the winter months, the linen cloth was rolled up and stored until summer. Only when the weather became stable was the fabric brought out for further treatment, entering the stages of bleaching and finishing, processes that ultimately determined the final quality of the linen. The woven linen, rolled in lengths of varying size, along with skeins of spun flax yarn, was now ready for the boiling stage. Work began at the wooden boiling vat, known as a bautube, with a capacity of about 200 liters and set on a three-legged stand. Mr. Kloos and Mrs. Both of whom had carried out boiling and bleaching in earlier years, undertook this task.
So. Scher noch einmal. So, das ist fertig.
Before the cloth was taken to the meadow, loops, usually made of linen yarn, were sewn into the selvages so the fabric could later be pegged to the ground with small wooden stakes known as peach. In some cases, rope was used instead.
So. Oh, das war nicht gerollt.
Ja, mach es noch
War
einmal.
nicht gut gegangen.
Ja, mach es noch einmal.
So, jetzt ist es. Wollen wir die sehen?
The linen strips varied greatly in length. The longest measured between 40 and 80 meters, while shorter pieces were only about 7 to 10 meters long. To prepare the water for the boiling vat, water was drawn from a nearby well and carried using a shoulder yoke, a common implement in everyday rural life in Dickensheed until the 1950s, used not only for hauling water, but also for transporting animal feed.
Ja, ich gucke mal. Ach, ich meine, das reicht. Ach, das reicht, aber kannst du noch einer Becher hier, Adel? Zieh noch einer hin.
The water level in the boiling vat was carefully adjusted to prevent overflow when the cloth was added. The linen was arranged in the vat in a deliberate order. First the large rolls of cloth, then the shorter lengths, followed by curtain fabric, and finally the skeins of flax yarn.
Kann ich von der Wand schäben?
Nix.
Na ja, da roll.
Alles in Ordnung.
Du liest aber ganz genau.
Ja, muss ich ja.
This sequence allowed the water to penetrate evenly through each layer of fabric and yarn. While the cloth and yarn soaked in the vat, water was brought to a boil in the wash house, and wood ash was prepared in advance for the subsequent lye boiling stage.
Ist gut, wenn man so klein ist.
Ja.
Once the hot water was ready, it was drawn into buckets and carried to the boiling vat. The remaining cold water in the vat was drained off, and the outlet at the bottom was sealed with a wooden plug to prepare for mixing the solution.
Jo, Wasser ist gut, aber wir können draußen weitermachen, die Beet.
Gehen ja schon wieder Wasser ablassen.
Ja, ja. Kannst du machen. So, was soll jetzt? Lass uns stehen. So.
Across the mouth of the vat, an ash filter cloth, known as an aschentouch, was spread flat and covered with a thick layer of oat straw. Wood ash, collected from household stoves and fireplaces, was then evenly scattered over the straw. The straw served to distribute the ash uniformly and to trap impurities, preventing them from falling into the vat. Before the hot water was poured on, the ash was carefully inspected to remove any contaminants or foreign matter. As the hot water was poured through the layer of wood ash, an alkaline solution formed, whose active components were primarily potassium salts, especially potassium carbonate. This lye percolated through the cloth and flax yarn, washing out dirt and residual natural pigments from the fibers and preparing the material for the subsequent bleaching stage. In terms of cleaning efficiency, wood ash lye was comparable to soda. From the 1930s onward, everyday laundry in Dickenscheid was increasingly washed with soap or industrial detergents. For coarse linen, however, the traditional method of lye boiling continued to be maintained. After about 4 to 5 hours, once the solution in the vat had cooled, the lye was drained into a zinc basin. It was then reheated in a large wash kettle with a capacity of around 100 liters, about 10 buckets of water, and poured back into the boiling vat.
Ja. Gut.
Wood ash lye is brown in color and produces little to no foam, unlike ordinary soapy water. This cycle of heating and recirculating the solution was repeated roughly 4 to 5 times. Although freshly prepared lye was more effective, in practice the same solution was often reused to conserve water. In the final cycle, the rolls of cloth and skeins of yarn were left to soak in the vat overnight, allowing the alkaline solution to penetrate fully and take full effect. On the following morning, once the wood ash lye had completely cooled, it was drained from the vat, bringing the lye boiling stage to an end. The ash filter cloth, together with the damp oat straw and the remaining ash residues, was removed from the vat. 3 people carried these materials to the manure heap on the far side of the yard, where they continued to be reused within the farm's agricultural cycle.
Ja, komm, Otto, komm, Otto. Das ist viel zu schwer. Packen wir nicht. Ne? Oder bist du verrückt, da fahren?
Saturated with the alkaline solution, the linen cloth and skeins of yarn were now considerably heavier. They were laid out on wooden boards to drain, then stacked onto a wheelbarrow and transported back to the meadow, where the bleaching process would begin.
Das kennen wir noch. Das ist gut, ja. Danke. Ja.
The meadow used for bleaching was located behind the granary, close to the farmyard. The grass there had to be kept short, but not freshly cut, to prevent grass sap from adhering to the cloth and causing stains.
Ja, dass man ankriegt. Ja, was? Ja, aber ja, das ist doch nicht eine Hose. Der hat nicht eine Hose, eine besser. Schwätzt du so viel, schafft er bis? Ja, macht man Mann. Gib mir auch die Wehe da.
When the cloth lengths were brought out to the bleaching meadow, they were still folded lengthwise and laid out on the grass. 2 long strips were placed in the center, while the shorter lengths were arranged on either side. The cloth was temporarily fixed to the ground with wooden pegs. Adequate spacing was left between each strip to allow the fabric to be fully spread later, and to ensure that water could be evenly applied over the entire surface. Linen cloth was classified according to fineness and intended use. Coarse linen, known as horte, was used for sacks and packing cloth. Medium-grade linen, called varish, sometimes blended with cotton, was commonly made into bed sheets, handkerchiefs, and work clothing. Finer linens were reserved for tablecloths, shirts, curtains, and items forming part of a bridal trousseau. White linen held particular importance in the dowries of farming families. Once all the cloth lengths had been laid out on the meadow, their surfaces were opened flat and smoothed. A crocheted linen curtain was added to be bleached alongside them. The flax skeins were untwisted, separated, and laid loosely on the grass to increase their exposure to water, air, and light. Before being fixed in place, the cloth was fully spread to its full width. While the surfaces were further smoothed, the shorter lengths were joined together. Small wooden pegs were then driven through the sewn loops along the selvages, anchoring the cloth to the ground and keeping it under light, even tension so it could not shift or be lifted by the wind. Throughout the bleaching period, which lasted several weeks, the long lengths of cloth were kept under this constant tension. Under the continuous action of water, sunlight, and air, natural oxidizing agents such as hydrogen peroxide and ozone gradually formed, breaking down the remaining pigments in the flax fibers through oxidation. During this time, the fabric was never allowed to dry completely, as this would cause yellowing. Meanwhile, clean water was drawn from the household well and carried in watering cans. Regular and even watering of the entire fabric surface ensured that the bleaching process proceeded uniformly and without interruption. Throughout the bleaching period, Mr. Kloss and Mr. Muller took turns drawing clean water from the household well and filling the watering cans, which the women then used to evenly sprinkle the cloth lengths spread across the meadow.
So, wenn wir nochmal hinfüllen. Machen wir die Gießkanne nochmal voll. Ja, Wasser hinzuführen. Da kann er aber noch tun,
Although Dickensheide had a domestic water supply system as early as 1907, piped water was available only inside the houses. For outdoor work, the well remained the primary source. This natural bleaching process could last up to 14 days and was once widespread throughout the Rhineland before gradually giving way to chemical methods such as chlorine and hydrogen peroxide bleaching. Throughout the bleaching period, the cloth had to be closely supervised, sometimes even at night, especially when the bleaching meadow lay far from the settlement. Traces of this work remain embedded in the rural landscape, preserved in place names bearing the term Bleich. During bleaching, the cloth lengths were repeatedly unpegged and turned section by section, so that both sides were evenly exposed to water, air, and sunlight. They were then stretched flat again, watered, and re-secured. Once the desired whiteness was achieved, the linen was taken indoors, rinsed with clean water, dried, and smoothed. In this state, the cloth was ready for storage, cutting and sewing for everyday use, or further processing by traditional techniques. The processes of weaving and bleaching linen in Dickensheide formed a continuous sequence of manual labor, organized seasonally and based on close coordination between people, tools, and natural forces. From the moment flax threads were set on the loom in winter to the retrieval of the finished white cloth at the end of summer, each stage directly shaped the final quality of the fabric. The weaving phase determined the cloth's structure and durability through precise threading, consistent tension, and controlled working rhythm. Lye boiling with wood ash solution followed, cleaning and stabilizing the fibers and preparing the cloth for bleaching. On the meadow, under prolonged exposure to water, sunlight, and air, natural oxidation processes lightened the flax fibers without compromising their strength. Once completed, the linen reached a state of cleanliness, whiteness, and stability, ready for use or further treatment. The entire cycle demonstrates that traditional linen production was not a series of isolated tasks, but a coherent technical system, closely bound to rural life and to working knowledge accumulated over generations. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If you enjoy content like this, please like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss any future stories. RaWMachines. Thanks you, and looks forward to seeing you again.